Hello, folks. My name is Jackson Wheat, and I recently had a conversation with creationist Kent Hovind. In my conversation with him, we primarily discussed mutations, natural selection, kinds, information, as well as other topics. After that exchange, I made a video on my channel titled Reflections on My Conversation with Kent Hovind, where I discussed what I did wrong, what I can work on, and points I didn't get to make in the original conversation. That video went up, and shortly thereafter, Hovind commented on it, saying, quote, "One major thing you could work on is to consider that maybe Kent is right and you are following a dumb religion. You don't seem to be able to see the forest because the trees are blocking your view. Your entire Reflections video is based on the false assumption that your evolutionary theory is true, and you just need to get better at presenting or defending it. Jackson, eternity is at stake here. You will be dead for a long time. You are more than just animated meat. You have a soul. Rethink this whole thing, please." End quote. Now, I didn't think that, on the whole, my video was very argumentative. One of the main points that Hovind resented was that I said he gish-galloped when I tried to make points. I stand behind that comment as well as everything else I said in my reflection video. One thing that particularly bugged me about this whole situation is the difference between Hovind's followers and himself. Specifically, Hovind's followers, for the most part, didn't stoop to saying you are following a dumb religion. They were very respectful and would calmly present their points without name-calling or insults. I realized, however, that while talking to his followers, that the way to combat scientific illiteracy isn't to argue with people in the comment section, but to have them actually read books or take classes on the material. I'd recommend Richard Dawkins' The Greatest Show on Earth, or Jerry Coyne's Why Evolution is True, but creationists could also simply read a biology textbook. Here's mine. It discusses several different ways that we know evolution is true, but creationists inevitably have a rationalization for each one. For example, when discussing homology, creationists say that all similar structures were just created by their personal God because it was a good design. Is a light source that gives us cancer good design? Is a galaxy that's almost entirely hostile to life except for a single minute speck good design? Anyway, the God hypothesis doesn't hold up in this regard, it doesn't hold up in any regard for that matter, because the relatedness of anatomical structures is independently confirmed by genetics and the fossil record. What Hovind and other creationists want people to believe is that a God mysteriously created some prokaryotes with features like our own, created eukaryotic protists with more features like our own, created simple animals with more features like our own, created deuterostomes with even more features like our own, etc. And this goes all the way up to chimps that have incredibly similar features like us. We do share between 96 and 99% of our DNA with chimps, and this fact has been confirmed by numerous sources, from the American Museum of Natural History, to the Genetic Literacy Project, to the Smithsonian Institute, to the American Society of Human Genetics, to the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It's a fact. Get over it. For the record, I can't believe anyone would say that the fossil record doesn't exist. Go to the Grand Canyon, for instance, and you can see that very simple creatures are in the lowest layers, Cambrian strata, with organisms getting more complex as you go up. There are no reptiles before the first amphibians, no amphibians before the first fish, and no fish before the first vertebrates. Denying the fossil record is denying observable reality. Don't take my word for it, go look for yourself. And the Grand Canyon couldn't possibly have been formed by a global flood, as there are layers in it carved by wind, not water, layers that have animals crawling along sand. The fact that the Grand Canyon has many twists and turns, whereas a flood is generally fairly straight, that's simple hydrodynamics, and even layers with imprints of raindrops. Clearly the rocks weren't underwater if raindrops were found on it. And the raindrops couldn't have imprinted just before the flood because the stratum wouldn't have had time to cement. Rod is a great series on explaining why the global flood did not and could not occur, so check it out. Anyway, Hovind made a response video to my reflection video, so let's take a look at what he said.
Jackson did a wonderful job trying to defend the evolution religion, as I call it.
So Hovind said that I was defending the evolution religion. Well, what's the definition of a religion? Merriam-Webster defines religion as the service and worship of God or the supernatural, commitment or devotion to religious faith or observance, a personal set or institutionalized system of religious attitudes, beliefs, and practices, or a cause, principle, or system of beliefs held to with ardor and faith. The same dictionary defines religious faith as belief and trust in and loyalty to God, or firm belief in something for which there is no proof. Does evolution meet any of those criteria? Clearly not. Ironically, religion is held dear to religious people unless they're using the word to criticize others. The same applies to faith. In fact, I think the second definition of religious faith is perfect as it mirrors Hebrews 11:1. Faith is the reason creationist organizations like Answers in Genesis post statements on the website saying that they will never concede their opponent is correct no matter how much evidence is presented against creationism. The Answers in Genesis statement of faith page says, quote, by definition, no apparent, perceived, or claimed evidence in any field, including history and chronology, can be valid if it contradicts the scriptural record. End quote. That's incredibly dishonest. Try to find a reputable scientific source like Nature or NCBI that says something similar for evolution.
Jackson, you're not getting it at all. Your thinking is, wow, how could I better present evolution? There's a whole other rabbit you need to chase. Maybe you should be thinking, maybe I'm on the wrong side of this argument to begin with.
Kent, I think you missed the point. Evolution is supported by a wide variety of evidence from comparative anatomy to embryology to biogeography to genetics and many, many more. I don't have to defend evolution from you nor any other creationist. There isn't a need for a defense of evolution because the generations of peer-reviewed scientific papers published on the subject testify to its veracity.
Maybe I'm trying to defend 2 + 2 is 5, and it's not 5. And that.
You say that defending evolution is like trying to defend that 2 + 2 = 5. That's a poor analogy because evolution doesn't violate mathematics. Math is actually a handy tool for studying population genetics and evolution. If you can write up a scientific paper, find some part of evolution that is impossible to accomplish, make an experiment, observation, or inference, and get your paper peer-reviewed and published in a reputable scientific journal, then I will concede that this part of evolution is false. However, neither you nor any other creationist has ever done so, and I'm not holding my breath for any of you to do so in the future. You also made another poor analogy in part 3 of our conversation where you said this.
General Motors puts a heater and an air conditioner in lots of their cars. What does that prove? Well, they're planning ahead. They don't know if it's going to a cold climate or a warm climate, so let's give them both.
Someone designing a car isn't a good analogy for evolution because evolution has no foresight. Mutations, natural selection, and speciation have no foresight. They adapt organisms to a particular environment while that population is in the environment. Evolution doesn't adapt organisms for environments on another side of the world that the animal is never naturally going to be exposed to.
I am for truth and against error. That's all. If the truth leads to evolution being true, I'll follow it, but I don't think it leads there. And so I just want the truth exposed and error exposed.
I totally agree. Exposing the error of claims is very important. For example, let's look at this claim in part 2 of our conversation.
And, okay, there's still a bug. It's a ladybug. That's not evolution. It's not going to even help the evolution theory. It's the same kind of animal. There are no examples anywhere in history or anywhere in the present, or anywhere in the fossil record. There's no fossil record in the fossils.
There's no fossil record? Really? Fossil record is defined by Encyclopedia Britannica as the history of life as documented by fossils, the remains or imprints of the organisms from earlier geological periods preserved in sedimentary rock. This observably exists, and here are 2 examples. The first one is some fossils from Cambrian strata in Canada called the Burgess Shale. There are no fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, or mammals in this strata, and there are no fish at all in Cambrian strata because fish didn't appear until the Middle Ordovician. This is confirmed all across the world. Another part of the fossil record is the Morrison Formation from the United States where many Jurassic dinosaurs perished. Is it a hoax, or does the fossil record actually exist? I'll let you decide. Even Answers in Genesis points out that there is a fossil record, albeit they believe some pretty wrong things about it. Explaining what that is exactly would take a separate video. Now let's look at another demonstrably false claim.
Correct, but see, you have a chicken and an egg. You got a chicken and an egg problem here. That's called fusion. What you're referring to. You can't fuse past iron. As far as I've never heard of anybody being able to use fusion to go past iron.
He says that elements beyond iron can't be created through fusion or stellar nucleosynthesis, or at the very least, he's never heard of anyone being able to fuse past iron. Well, as it turns out, elements beyond iron or past the iron peak can be created through supernova nucleosynthesis.
Now hold on, Jackson. That is simply not true. You called me and started this, and I asked after you called me if I could record the conversation, and we started over. So it was your choice to do the phone. I didn't have control over this. You got to talk as much as I did.
It's certainly true that I was the one who called him. I am, after all, nobody, so he'd have no reason calling me in particular. I had a wonderful friend named Gonna Go For It, who has a YouTube channel and has also talked to Kent, count how much time I spoke and how much time Kent spoke. As it turned out, in part 1 I spoke for 13 minutes and 27 seconds, and Kent spoke for 22 minutes and 50 seconds. In part 2 I spoke for 8 minutes 32 seconds, and Kent spoke for 22 minutes 23 seconds. And in part 3 I spoke for 5 minutes 58 seconds, and Kent spoke for 9 minutes 25 seconds. That means Kent spoke for about 26 minutes more than I did. This puts to rest the falsehood that we spoke for the same amount of time.
Now, if you're feeling bad because most people are commenting that you lost, I don't think it's because you weren't in control. I think it's because you're on the wrong side of the argument.
I think that most of the comments say that I lost, or am stupid, or whatever else, because primarily your followers watch the conversation, so of course they're going to be partial to you. For the record, I don't want anyone to be partial to me personally. I want people to be partial to reality. And I can only speak when he allowed.
That's not true. You spoke as much as you wanted.
I spoke as much as I wanted to? I think that I did get to say a good bit, but you interrupted me far more than I did you. Here are some examples.
Sure.
So
well,
we can see.
Hold on. Let me give my input on that so far, and then you can go on.
In fish.
Right. Let me explain that. Homologous.
And so with the slender Clarkia, which was the flower I mentioned earlier.
Okay, let me repeat that for people to look it up. Slender Clarkia.
And that's how evolution works. It works on the
No, slow down. No. Jackson, that's not how evolution works.
It happens. And
No. Let me hang on, Jackson. I want to object for a minute.
Anyway, moving on. I mentioned in my reflections video that I made the poor choice to describe DNA as containing information, and Kent said this.
Now, hold on a minute. The genes do code information. How else can you say it? Just like a computer code that your computer is running, any computer program is running line after line after line of information. I disagree, Jackson. Now, come on, let's have this debate again. You can call in. You got my cell phone number, and we'll do it again and record it. There's nothing wrong with the word information. The DNA code contains enormous amounts of information. That little code tells you what color your hair is going to be and what color your eyes are going to be and each of the muscles in your body and the digestive system and the skeletal system. It is a phenomenal amount of information. There's nothing wrong with that word.
There are certainly better ways to describe what DNA contains, especially since it has protein-coding genes, non-functional pseudogenes, and endogenous retroviruses that are the remains of viruses that infected our ancestors. Information doesn't mean anything in the context of genetics without a definition. I think that if we are going to use the word information, it should at least mean protein-coding genes because their sequences of nucleotides allow the formation of the structures Kent mentions. Computer code is also a bad analogy for DNA because DNA mutates and is naturally selected without intelligent oversight. Computer code, on the other hand, does neither and is totally guided by programmers. And by the way, that enormous amount of information that DNA supposedly carries, if we're going to say information means protein coding genes, only takes up at the very most 20% of the whole genome. I then pointed out in my reflections video that I let Kent pull me around too much, but he disagreed, saying this.
No, come on now, Jackson. I didn't pull you around. I stopped you when you tried to go off to other topics, and let's settle this. I think you have been taught some things at your university that are simply not true. You have chosen to believe them as true and have determined to defend this, and it's just not common sense.
In reality, Kent is the master of Gish galloping, second only to Duane Gish, and this is evident in his past debates.
All right, well, let's define a few positions. I believe very strongly that the Earth is about 6,000 years old. It was created in 6 literal 24-hour days. This position would make a few predictions. The Bible says clearly, in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, and all that in them is. Everything created in 6 days. Now, based on that prediction, based on that premise, we can make a few predictions, which is what science is supposed to do. A scientific theory is supposed to allow you to make predictions. I predict, based on the Bible teaching, that the universe will show evidence of order and design all over the place, okay? I predict that we'll find thousands of symbiotic relationships in nature, animals that require certain plants and plants that require certain animals, and it works just fine because they were all created within a few days of each other. Not a problem at all for the creationist viewpoint. I predict that there will be limits to the variations that life forms are able to produce. The Bible says they will bring forth after their kind, and that's what we've observed. 6,000 years of human history shows us dogs produce dogs. Every time. Might be a big dog or a little dog. It might have curly hair or straight hair, but it's going to be a dog, guaranteed, okay? Farmers actually count on that. I mean, when they plant corn, they expect to get corn. And so far, it has happened. So certainly there are variations, but there are definite limits to the variations, and this is where the major difference comes between the creationist and the evolutionist. I predict that there are not only limits to the variation, I predict that there will be actually a purpose to life because we were designed by a creator for a purpose. That's a prediction based on the Bible view. I predict there will be non-material things like love, sense of justice, mercy, innate knowledge of right and wrong, a conscience, and absolute truth. Those things are not possible with the evolution theory. They are predicted based on the creation theory. Somebody designed this for a reason. I predict that there will be a way to find the will of the creator, such as messengers speaking for him, or maybe even a book telling us why he did it and how he did it. I predict there will be an afterlife where we will face the creator to give an accounting. Okay?
Clearly, no one could debate him and debunk all of his arguments in one sitting because that would require an extensive knowledge of science, history, and philosophy. And since history and philosophy are irrelevant in any debate as to whether evolution is true, these are just red herrings meant to lead the debater away. Sounds familiar. But in the clip I just showed, having an accurate understanding of science, history, and philosophy would show all of his arguments to be wrong. I don't have time to go through them here, as that would carry us too far afield. However, Kent also gish-galloped in our conversation too.
Number one is cosmic evolution. Where did time, space, and matter come from? They'll say the Big Bang. Okay, what exploded? Where did it come from, and where did the energy come from, and why are there laws like the law of gravity and inertia and centrifugal force and the laws of the pendulum, etc.? Why are there any laws? Where did they come from? So cosmic evolution is a giant obstacle, I think, to those who want humans and strawberries to be related.
I'm a biology major, so I don't know the answers to most of the questions that he asked in here. I do know, however, that the Big Bang wasn't an explosion, it was an expansion of space. That really needs to be fixed, Kent. Where that space came from is currently being worked on by physicists.
And Gish has done, I think, over 300 debates. I believe he's dead now, but he did many debates, about 300 of them, with atheists. And they would accuse him of doing the Gish Gallop, which means let's mention 10 topics and run off, and the atheist said, I don't get time to answer them all. When exactly the opposite is true. It was the evolutionists doing what they call the Gish Gallop, and what you tried to do a dozen times in our discussion.
Kent, I challenge you or anyone to find a dozen places where I mentioned 10 or so arguments without letting you respond. Have fun. He then watches the part of my video where I point out that a commenter said Hovind would jump from one point to a totally unrelated one and says this.
When you talk about beneficial mutations, I talked about beneficial mutations and said, show me one. But then I would say something to the effect of, this idea of beneficial mutations, changes within a certain kind of animal, is only a small slice of a much bigger picture. And abiogenesis, the origin of life from non-living material, is an essential part of evolution theory.
So Hovind proved exactly what the commenter said he did. He would agree to one mutation, but then jump to something completely different. That's called a red herring fallacy, and it was noticed by a number of people. And no, abiogenesis is not essential to biological evolution because biological evolution is defined as genetic change in a population over time. Look it up. Yes, evolution starts with a population by definition. How life originated is an interesting question, but it has no bearing on the evolution of organisms. But Kent goes on.
And the 6 stages I give of evolution are, the atheists all hate it because it exposes so clearly the stupidity of their religion.
I don't think atheists actually hate when you talk about your so-called 6 stages of evolution. People who understand how evolutionary biology works, atheist or not, are just annoyed that when you have a conversation with them about biology, you switch the topic to cosmology and physics, which have no relevance to a conversation about evolutionary biology. Tony Reed deals with this specific argument in his video, How Creationism Taught Me Real Science, 37, The Definitions of Evolution. Here's a taste.
In any case, there is only one definition for the word evolution. Although there are countless contexts for the word, there is only one scientifically accepted theory of evolution. Anytime the word is co-opted into a creationist argument in a context that is not a consequence of changing alleles, it is dishonestly conflating two separate ideas. As I said at the start of this series, I'm appropriating the word evolutionism to mean the scientific consensus. In doing so, I am both making up a word and misapplying it for the sake of being able to meet creationists on their own terms. Hopefully, common terminology will allow them to see how creationism taught me real science.
Please watch the rest of it because it's fantastic, as it dispatches a number of arguments that Kent and other creationists make. While you're at it, watch the whole series. Anyway, moving on.
You have to have time-space matter come into existence. That's number one. Cosmic evolution. You have to have the stars forming. You have to have all the elements forming. You have to have life get started from non-living material, what you call abiogenesis. If not, what's going to evolve? That is part of the theory. Read the textbooks. That's what my gripe is. This is what we're teaching the kids. Now, of course, when you get them in a corner, the evolutionists want to say, well, we're just talking about variation within the gene code. Well, that's not what your books do, and it's not what you do in a classroom.
Contrary to what Kent's saying, how the universe and matter formed aren't taught in the biology classroom. They've never been taught in any biology class I've taken. And my freshman college textbook, Campbell Biology 9th edition, spends a total of 2.5 pages talking about abiogenesis out of 1,261 pages. Those 2.5 pages talking about abiogenesis make use of peer-reviewed observations, experiments, and inferences to show their point, which is something creationists never do to show their hypotheses. I then pointed out again that Kent gish-galloped, and he responded with this.
Okay, no, I resent that. I did not. I will stick on any one topic you want. Jackson, call me anytime. You got my cell phone number. Let's do this again. And I promise you, it'll be you that does the gish galloping. I'm not afraid of any of the topics the evolutionists can bring up. You want to talk about one specific one? Let's narrow it way down and talk about it. If you want to talk about gene mutation or something, we can talk about that. But I would point out to the listening audience that this is a small slice of a much bigger picture.
Really? You never gish-galloped? I guess that clip I showed earlier didn't exist. Fortunately, here's another from the second part of our conversation.
But stellar evolution, I think, is a royal problem because we've never, to my knowledge, never seen a star form. Certainly the idea of gases condensing into a solid is counterintuitive to all known physics today. Gases, when you try to compress them, they build up pressure and they expand away from each other. It takes enormous pressure to condense gas. I mean, you got to have an air compressor or something like that. Where's this energy coming from? So, number three, my point would be stellar evolution, I think, is a giant problem for the evolution, for the general evolution theory. I'm defining the word evolution. Number four, you have to have organic evolution. Somewhere, somehow, non-living material, stardust, has to come alive. Now, whether it comes in a single cell or a multi-cell doesn't matter. The fact is, there's a difference between living and non-living. And this is not something dead coming to life. It's something that never was alive. All of a sudden, you go from non-life to life. That is a giant step called organic evolution, and there's no evidence of it happening. No, they can't even make it happen in the laboratory. Number five, if you want to write this down, is macroevolution. Macroevolution is where an animal changes to a different kind of animal. Number six is called microevolution. This is variations within the kind. That's what you gave a definition of. That one is actually science. I believe in microevolution.
Anyway, moving on.
Well, could it be, even considered the option that maybe I was right on those points and maybe you were wrong? It wasn't a gish gallop at all. And as I said, I resent you saying that. It's you that did it over and over. Go back and listen to it yourself.
I was the one who gish-galloped? Huh. It's a good thing I posted our conversation to my channel so people don't have to go far to see what I actually said. The closest thing I could find to me gish-galloping is this comment from part 1 of our conversation.
And so, I came to my understanding of evolution because of the inferences that can be drawn from all of the observational and experiments. And so, these observation experiments come from biogeography, the fossil record, philology, geology, embryology,
Hold on,
atavism,
slow down. Before you list all these, let's go take them one at a time.
Anyway, he then admits to using a red herring to move away from the point I was making.
Again, Jackson, is me showing the audience, the listening audience, because thousands have watched this now, the bigger picture. A mutation within the same kind of animal, blonde hair, gray hair, blue eyes, etc., that is just a small slice of a really big picture that you want to get all the people to swallow, which is that a frog turned to a prince over billions of years. That is exactly what the evolution theory teaches. Now knock it off.
Well, we can't talk about the bigger picture until we agree to the smaller picture, which you wouldn't agree to based on the definitions and examples I gave. Also, you're misleading the audience by saying that evolution teaches that a frog evolved into a prince over billions of years. If you want to get specific, humans and frogs share a common ancestor that was an amphibian approximately 340 million years ago, and that common ancestor is evidenced by genetics and fossils. The way you say it, though, a frog turned into a human over billions of years, makes the process sound like a single metamorphosis event that took billions of years to complete. So if you're going to say that evolution teaches that a frog turned into a human over billions of years, then you've no place to discuss evolution with professionals. Finally, on this clip, this is the place where you insinuate that I lied, and your followers certainly expressed your implication. Now, if I got something wrong, then that's all I did. I got it wrong. That doesn't mean I lied, because lie means there was a deliberate intent to deceive, and I have no such intent to deceive anyone. In one comment thread, I asked your followers to show me a specific place where I lied, and they just doubled down on their claim without showing any evidence. Shame on them. And, if your followers really want to know what evolution says, then they should pick up a biology textbook.
And I was simply constantly keeping this in focus. It's not a red herring. I'm not trying to draw your attention off on something else. I was trying to keep people's attention focused.
Really? You were trying to keep people focused? Is that why when I asked you about the definition of evolution, you took us through your 6 different types of evolution that span cosmology, chemistry, biochemistry, and biology? You consider that keeping us on track?
I think all the little minor mutations they give is the red herring, as if that's somehow supposed to prove that we all came from a rock 4.6 billion years ago, which is exactly what evolution says. Read the textbooks. I'll show you. Watch my video number 4 where I show it right from the books.
I'm frankly surprised that he said I'm not trying to draw your attention away, but mutations don't prove we evolved from a rock. Of course they don't. We didn't evolve from rocks. Abiogenesis is concerned with macromolecules, not rocks, evolving into what we would consider living organisms. Just pick up a Campbell Biology 9th edition. That's what I used.
Okay, now hold it. First of all, what is wrong with that? I think you should study both sides. I'll read anything the evolutionists put out. I read stuff the creationists put out. I think you should do the same thing. It looked to me like from your argument on the YouTube that you've only seen the evolution side and you've been indoctrinated into believing that's true. So you didn't lose the debate because I read creationist articles. You read the debate, you lost the debate because you're on the wrong side.
The problem is that creationist organizations like Answers in Genesis and others aren't interested in actually learning about evolution, but rather misrepresenting and lying about it. And I read Answers in Genesis quite a lot. That's how I know they're so wrong about so much. With regard to Answers in Genesis, Wikipedia says this, quote, "In a rare case of open dissent within the movement over the substance of creation science, Answers in Genesis, AIG, published a 2002 position paper titled Arguments We Think Creationists Should Not Use. After Hovind issued a point-by-point rebuttal, Carl Weiland, Ken Ham, and Jonathan Sarfati of AIG wrote that the claims made by Hovind were fraudulent and contained mistakes in facts and logic which do the creationist cause no good. In particular, AIG criticized Hovind for persistently using discredited or false arguments as well as fraudulent claims from Ron Wyatt, and described one of Hovind's claims as self-refuting." End quote. Take that how you will.
Now stop right there. That is so cruel to say such a thing. Just to blanketly say these organizations are wrong on everything. Come on, grow up, Jackson. That's not common sense.
This might have been a bit of a melodramatic statement on my part, but I can guarantee that all the organizations I showed deny much research in every field that they talk about, whether physics, chemistry, biology, paleontology, geology, history, or philosophy. And to be fair, I didn't say they were wrong about everything, just almost everything. For a short while, I wrote articles about Answers in Genesis pages on a, quote, blog titled The Undefined Atheist. It's been a while since I was on it, but I do remember that there were numerous issues in the pages I looked at. Moving on, Kent comes to the part of my video where I talk about trying to pin him down on definitions and says this.
No, that was difficult to pin you down, Jackson. What exactly is a species? What exactly do you mean by that word evolution? Define those very carefully for me where we can dissect them. What exactly is a species, and what exactly does the word evolution mean?
Really? Then why did I define species according to the biological species concept as organisms that can interbreed and produce fertile offspring? And if I didn't define evolution, then why did I say this in part 2 of our conversation?
So the definition of evolution is genetic change in a population, genetic change in a population over time.
It's a little awkward when I can just go back and watch the debate to see what was actually said. But anyways, let's move on. If you watch our conversation, then you'll see that Kent uses the word kind and information quite freely without definitions. Then I point out in my video that Kent doesn't admit to the existence of beneficial mutations, and he responds with this.
Because, Jackson, you don't know that there's no side effects. I pointed out that if something happens that's a mutation, that someone looks at it and says, aha, this is beneficial, I think it takes a whole lot more study to determine if it really is.
Actually, the doctors and geneticists have spent a lot of time studying these mutations and came to the conclusion after years of study that they have no harmful side effects.
And I am unaware of any beneficial mutations, A, that don't have any deleterious effects somewhere else, and B, who's this going to marry? And that's why I pointed that out. How's this going to get passed on in the gene code?
Mutations with no harmful side effects include apolipoprotein A1 Milan, LRP5, and tetrachromatic vision. For the first one, an entire family in Milan, Italy has this mutation because one of their ancestors first got it and passed it on to his or her progeny. As I said in our conversation, non-lethal mutations are incremental, and this, as well as the other mutations I mentioned, is an example of that. Humans have approximately 130 mutations per zygote, and numerous neutral mutations are passed from parent to offspring, where the parent doesn't have any problem finding someone to marry. After talking about mutations, he brings up this.
And how 3, this uncovers a whole philosophy that, the better ones should live and the other ones should die. This is Adolf Hitler 101. Let's get the beneficial, the mutated Aryan race and let them survive. I just pointed out the philosophical problems with going down this rabbit trail at all. So,
eugenics, because when you can't logically expose the flaws in something, you bring up Nazis to induce guilt by association in your opponent. This is an example of Godwin's law, which states that as a conversation continues, the more likely one is to bring up Nazis. Eugenics actually goes back to ancient Greece well over a millennium before Darwin came up with evolution, but no one knew the mechanism by which certain traits were preserved and passed down. That took Darwin, Mendel, and others to figure out. And we know today that evolution isn't just about survival of the fittest, but survival of the fit. You don't have to be the absolute fastest, or strongest, or prettiest to pass on your genes in nature. Trying to link neo-Darwinist evolution to the racist social Darwinism that Hitler professed is similar to trying to link the Christian identity movement to Christianity as a whole, because both have Christian in the name. Anyway, I then talk about in my video how creationists aren't allowed to admit when a beneficial mutation has been observed, so Kent said this.
You say creationists aren't allowed to admit. Nobody tells me what to say or do. I'm allowed to say whatever I want.
Really, Kent? Did you honestly think that I meant you and all other creationist ministries are being suppressed by some outside force? Clearly, I didn't mean that. What was meant by that statement was even though mutations that have positive benefits for an organism with no side effects have been observed, creationists refuse to call those beneficial mutations. The reason creationists are so against using the phrase is that accepting the existence of beneficial mutations would go a long way towards proving that new structures can arise in nature without divine influence. If creationists admit that new structures can arise in nature without divine influence, then their followers will start to realize that creationists are wrong on this point. When people realize that creationists are wrong on that point, the people will realize creationists are wrong on other points and leave the creationists, meaning the creationists lose money and power. If mutations and sexual recombination can cause the appearance of new structures or abilities, then those traits can be naturally selected. We see this happening in nature all the time. And if those traits can be passed down through the generations, then they can eventually result in new species. We also see this happening in nature. This is how evolution, not just microevolution, works. And this one example that I use totally excludes other mechanisms of evolution like genetic drift, gene flow, the founder effect, and sexual and artificial selection. I then pointed out in my video that Kent wouldn't accept my definitions of evolution and macroevolution, to which he said this.
That's because, Jackson, you keep trying to slip in stuff. You give examples of variations within the genetic code. Okay, well, that doesn't explain where this code came from to begin with, how any variations happen, and are they beneficial, and who's it going to marry, and how this ties into the big philosophical picture of everybody else has to die now to make this really work. Ultimately, you have to have this over billions of years. And anyway, go ahead.
The real reason Kent wouldn't agree to the definitions of evolution and macroevolution, even though anyone can pull them straight off dictionary.com, Wikipedia, Merriam-Webster, etc., is that his followers can't know what the words actually mean, that the words don't include so many other things that he claims they do. Biologic evolution is simply genetic change in a population over time, or some variant of that, perhaps using change in allele frequencies instead of genetic change. And macroevolution is defined as genetic change at or above the level of species. Biologic evolution has nothing to do with how the universe, chemicals, stars, or life formed, and macroevolution has nothing to do with one kind becoming another, especially when no one has defined what kind means and it has no practical value. My video goes on talking about the definition of evolution, to which Kent says this.
It's only imagination. And this is why I pointed out that every farmer of everything from cows to corn counts on evolution not happening. Sure, he gets a variety, but if it's too far away from the norm, it's usually sterile or detrimental to the population.
In reality, farmers do count on evolution occurring. That's why we get commercialized corn from teosint and giant beef cattle from regular cows. But farmers also realize that the insects which eat their crops evolve too, so farmers have to continually get new pesticides to deal with them. Kent goes on about macroevolution.
Did you give me any examples of that, Jackson? You gave me no examples of macroevolution above the level of species, and you didn't clearly define what a species is. It's you that's not defining stuff.
You're correct in saying that I didn't give any examples of macroevolution in our conversation. The reason for that is, I think, we didn't really go there or just briefly mention macroevolution. Some examples, however, are cichlids, finches, mosquitoes, and hawthorn flies. I did define in our conversation what a fair definition of species is, giving the basic biological species concept. I say again that it was a fair definition to use because evolution isn't founded on what a species is, and the definition can be used with reasonable accuracy. What defines a species, according to biologists, is a combination of reproductive abilities, genetics, and ecological niche, and the specifics of the process by which something is determined to be a separate species was unnecessary to our conversation.
My point would be, sure, variations happen, but they're limited, and most of the ones we see today are induced by man or selected by man. Natural selection would select those that survive in nature. That's what it's all about.
I've heard from various creationists that the ability of organisms to vary genetically is limited, but nobody seems to be doing research to prove what the limit is. Strange. In my video, I go on to talk about the species concept, and Kent says,
Okay, we did talk about that. I said a horse and a zebra can interbreed. They are different species, but they can interbreed. The Bible gives a pretty simple way to tell. It says that they will bring forth after their kind. If they're capable of bringing forth offspring, they're the same kind of animal.
To be clear, Kent is saying that the definition of kind is the reproductive boundary of an organism, which is in contrast to what he said kind meant in our conversation, that is, about the level of family and modern taxonomy. It's also in contrast to what Ken Ham said kind meant, which was approximately the level of family or order. Georgia Purdom said in an interview that kind meant the reproductive boundary of an organism, but she also said in that same interview that there was a bird kind and a dinosaur kind. I show her interview in my video, Response to Evolutionist Chapter 3. So creationists need to get their story straight. Kent continues about species.
Because it's not clearly defined. You said there's problems with the definition. Obviously, you're reading from a script here. I agree. There are real problems with the definition. That's why I don't think you should go on and build a whole lifestyle and build a whole eternity based on something as shaky as that word species.
Well, then it's a good thing no one builds an entire worldview around the concept of a species. I know you're trying to denigrate evolution, but this is just absurd. Clearly, evolution is still true even if there's not yet a perfectly encapsulating definition of species, and evolution would still be true if we didn't use the word species at all. I then talk about the importance of inference in my video, but Kent says this.
Inference does not carry the same weight as observation. In any court of law, there are different levels of evidence carries different weight. In medical field, we see that all the time, where a doctor sees red spots on the patient. Okay, we can all see the patient has red spots. That is observation. One doctor infers that it is a certain disease. He may or may not be right. How many people have been wrongly treated for a disease because they made the wrong inference? So, no, I'm simply pointing out, before you gish-gallop off on something else, that inference does not carry the same weight as observation. And in forensic science and medical science, many things are inferred, and people are going to jail because they made the wrong inference from the evidence. They see the evidence and infer George did it, and he didn't do it. But he goes to jail over that. So be cautious. And you have inferred many things about evolution that are not part of observational science. And I didn't gish-gallop anywhere.
Actually, inference holds quite a lot of weight. In fact, inference can be more important than direct observation. As evidence of this, I want to bring to light the paper Summaries of 46 Cases in Which Mistaken or Perjured Eyewitness Testimony Put Innocent Persons on Death Row. Inferential data is what got, for example, Kirk Bloodsworth off death row. After 5 claimed eyewitnesses put Bloodsworth on death row, DNA evidence got him off. That's why DNA evidence is more important than eyewitness testimony. We also know that eyewitness testimony can be wrong. That's why psychologists made the video with the basketballs and a guy in a gorilla costume. And how many more people have been correctly medically treated by inference than not? Sure, doctors can be wrong because they're human, but when one observes a great preponderance of evidence for a certain disease, then the likelihood that the doctor is correct increases. My video then moves on to unicellular organisms colonializing, and Kent says,
Numerous experiments have got unicellular organisms colonizing, but that's a far cry from a new organ functioning like a liver or a stomach or an intestine or an eyeball.
I agree that unicellular organisms colonializing, not colonizing, is a far cry from a stomach or some other multicellular organ, but that's not the point. It's a red herring. Continuing on this topic, Kent says,
Oh, I did not say they go straight to multicellular. I don't think the colonial stage has never been demonstrated to go to a animal with different tissues and organs. You can infer that if you want and believe that if you want, which is what I pointed out 100 times in our discussion. It's a religion. It's not observable science.
Well, let's see what he said in part 1 of our conversation.
It's a story. It's a fairy tale, I think. Now, let me make 2 points here before you go on. Single-celled organisms changing to multicelled. Are you aware of any 2 or 3 or 4 or 5-celled organisms that survive, other than a colony where each organism is doing the same thing? Are there any 2-celled organisms in the universe that you're aware of, or that anybody's aware of, or 3-celled or 4-celled? And I can answer the question by saying nobody's found one yet. I think the simplest life form that has multiple functions is about probably maybe 200 cells working together. So where are the 2-celled or the 3-celled or the 4-celled? I mean, the human body is probably 100 trillion cells working together to do the functions that we do. So to say it went from single cell to multicellular is great to say. Those words roll off the tongue easily, but it's not science.
For one thing, I was correct in saying that Kent asked for a unicellular organism becoming multicellular, not becoming colonial. And 2, there are actually organisms that can be made of only 2 cells, like the photosynthetic flagellate gonium. He's wrong on both points. 3, he makes a slight equivocation fallacy. He equates multicellularity with having different cell functions. Those aren't the same. He then makes an analogy for the transition from unicellular to multicellular organisms that just might take the cake for the most ridiculous analogy ever.
That the American colonies formed, they didn't turn them all into one human being. They're still individual human beings forming a colony.
So that's all I need to critique in his video, since the rest is essentially just his assertions and promotion of his channel. I want to end this by saying that I don't think I won, and to those few people who said in the comments that I did, that's nice, but I disagree. I didn't win. And Kent didn't win either. The only people who could win the conversation, if you can win a conversation at all, are those who come away with the fact that creationism is wrong. The winners are those who learn. Now, if Kent wants to make another video responding to this one, then that's his prerogative, but I'm not going to make another video responding to his response. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.